Yes, I've been admitting people, so I think we should just submit all when they
Okay.
come in. So,
Okay.
all right, yes, welcome everyone. Got a good group of folks showing up, and there's still people trickling in. But we do want to get started pretty much on time, so we don't. So we have lots of time for questions and plenty of time for discussing at the end. So welcome to the first ever Making Waves Confluence conversation. And I'd like to thank especially Provost Maria Simatilli for her inspiring and supporting the Making Waves initiative, and as well as our leadership team who is online here, Kathy AG, Nancy O'Neill, and Lisa Sermon-Haight. And then we also have a group of amazing interns that have been amazing at helping us do videos and stuff that I'm not good at. So the initiative is an effort really to embrace and celebrate that Grand Valley is surrounded by water. And the longest river in Michigan, the Grand River, happens to connect our two main campuses, and as well as the students and faculty and nearby communities. So the Making Waves initiative really tries to bring people together around that central focus of water, and to generate conversations and creative work among artists and engineers and poets and paleontologists and musicians and mathematicians. We're working right now with some musicians that are doing a special piece of music about the Great Lakes. We're really excited about that coming up. And we have over 100 guests tonight. They're still trickling in. I don't remember how many we're up to right now, but we have a lot of people coming tonight. And this includes students and faculty and members of the community and leaders and people from all different backgrounds and experience. So it's a great opportunity to share and to learn from each other. So this Confluence conversation is really a chance to have a conversation and hopefully learn from each other. So if you'd like to learn more about the Making Waves initiative, there's a website you can check out. It's where you found this information about the meeting, but it's www.gvsu.edu Making Waves. And if you happen to be a student who's here tonight and you're excited about water or passionate about water, get a hold of us. We'll find a job for you. There's lots of cool things that we're working on. So enough of an introduction. I think we're going to dive right into the first presentation so we don't go over time. And our first presentation is going to be recorded. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions. Let me go to the next slide so we can kind of give a sense of what we're doing. So our first speaker will be Deanna Apps from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She's the lead forecaster. And then our second speaker will be Kurt Terhar, and he's with the Ottawa County Parks. And this is just the general idea where we're headed. We're going to have a pre-recorded presentations by each of them. And so if you have questions, hold them to the end or put them in the chat window and we'll catch them at the end. But we'll have both the presentations, and then at the end we'll have time for question and answer, at least 10 or 15 minutes. And then if people want to stay over, I think both of their speakers will be willing to stay a little bit extra time to take questions from everyone. So without further ado, we will start the first presentation.
Hello, my name is Deanna Apps. I work for the Hydraulics and Hydrology Office at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Detroit District. Today I'm going to talk about Great Lakes water levels. I'll go over some basin hydrology and how we've gotten to high water, and then talk about some of the forecast products that we produce here at the Corps. To get started, I want to first talk about the Great Lakes Basin as a whole. So as you can see, two diagrams here on this slide, one being an aerial view on the right and a side profile view on the left. To start with the graphic on the right, you can see everything highlighted by that green area is representative of the Great Lakes Basin. So every drop of water that falls over the lakes or in that green area somehow accounts or impacts the water supply to the lakes. And as you can see here, it is also an international basin, meaning it has land on both the U.S. and Canadian sides of the border. On the left, you can see more of that side profile view, which helps to show how water flows through the basin. So starting in Lake Superior, water flows through the St. Mary's River into Lakes Michigan and Huron, through the St. Clair River into Lake St. Clair, through the Detroit River into Lake Erie, through the Niagara River over the Niagara Falls into Lake Ontario, and then out through the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I do want to note on this slide, there are two places in the system where outflows are regulated. One being through the St. Mary's River that connects Lake Superior and Lake Michigan-Huron, and then out through Lake Ontario through the St. Lawrence River. Both of these regulation plans are are done through the International Joint Commission through the respective boards of control. So the Lake Superior Board of Control and the Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Board of Control. However, I want to stress that the ability to regulate outflows in these two locations does not prevent extreme high or low lake levels, nor can it fully control lake levels. Lake levels are primarily driven by weather conditions in Mother Nature, and that's something that I'm going to touch on as we go through this presentation. So to start, I wanted to show some of the water level products that we have on our website. And one of those is our daily Great Lakes water levels reports and graphics. So as you can see on the left, we have daily lake-wide average water levels for each of the lakes. So Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Huron, St. Clair, Erie, and Ontario. Now you'll probably notice that Lake Michigan, Huron is considered one lake for these daily lake-wide average levels, as well as the monthly mean water levels, you'll notice. And that is because they're connected at the Straits of Mackinac, so from a hydrologic perspective, we consider them one lake because they rise and fall together. So you can access these reports. It gives you some of the statistics over the last year and what our period of record indicates, which our period of record of water levels goes back to 1918, and that's for monthly mean water levels. And then we also provide a graphic comparing the daily levels from this year to last year. You can also compare to the record high monthly levels, as well as the long-term average monthly levels as well. And also, we do provide our 6-month forecast on that graphic, which I'll talk about as we later on in this presentation. So how do we calculate these daily lake-wide average water levels for each of the lakes? And we do that using a network of water level gauges. So as you can see on this diagram, there's some blue dots and green dots that show the locations of water level gauges throughout the Great Lakes Basin. Those blue dots are representing gauges on the U.S. side of the border, which are operated by NOAA, or the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. The green dots are gauges run on the Canadian side of the border, and those are run by the Canadian Hydrographic Service. The bolded dots, so the ones that are larger and bolder in color, those are representative of the gauges that we use in the actual lake-wide average calculation for each lake. Which I've also highlighted those specific locations for each lake down on the bottom of the slide. So you can see like Lake St. Clair uses 2 water level gauges, Lake Michigan Huron uses 6. And we do this because we want to get an average of what the entire lake surface looks like. We understand that at individual locations, we're going to see variability in that lake level, maybe due to wind or other meteorological forcings. And we want to get an average of what that entire lake surface looks like, so we use this network that has the gauges surrounding around the lake to give us that average. So next I'm going to transition into some of the factors that impact water levels. And like we talked about on the first slide when we went over the Great Lakes Basin, we have to account for inflows and outflows for each lake. So if we're talking about, say for example, Lake Michigan Huron, we have to account for the inflow from the upstream lake. So we have to account for the inflow that's coming from the St. Mary's River, and then we also have to account for outflow through the St. Clair River. But then you'll see in the middle there, we have a term here we call net basin supply, which also impacts water levels. And those 3 variables all contribute to net basin supply, being we have precipitation over the lake, runoff to the lake, and evaporation off of the lake. So precipitation plus runoff minus evaporation, and all those 3 variables put together we call net basin supply. So what does that look like? How does net basin supply, or how do those variables change throughout the course of the year to impact water levels? And that's what you're going to see on this graphic, is how water levels change throughout the year depending on the weather conditions and the hydrologic cycle. So starting on the left here in the winter, when snow is accumulating, typically when the ground is frozen, is when we typically see the seasonal low in water level, sometime in the mid to late winter. As we enter the fall or enter the spring spring period and that snow starts to melt and we have increased rainfall, we start to see water levels rise or enter their period of seasonal rise, as we would say. And water levels rise until we get to about the mid to late summer and when they reach their seasonal peak. And during this time, the increased sunshine helps to warm the lake water, which is very important as we transition into the fall months because the primary driver of water level decline is evaporation. And evaporation occurs in the fall and early winter as a result of colder air moving over a relatively warm lake water surface. So that the greater that temperature difference between the air and the lake, so either a very warm lake or very cold air, can induce significant evaporation off of the lake and really what helps water levels decline during the fall and early winter period. And this is something that we'll touch on again later. So now I'm going to show you the full period of record of water levels that we have going back to 1918. Again, this is for monthly mean water levels. This is really the main water level statistics that we're putting out at the Corps, and this is data that's also coordinated with Environment and Climate Change Canada. So you'll see we have a hydrograph for each of the lakes, Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron, St. Clair, Erie, and Ontario. And you'll see the blue line that goes across for each of the lakes is a representation of the monthly mean water level, which begins in 1918, and on this graphic extends all the way through so far through the last current month of 2020, although 2020 data is still considered provisional. That red line that goes across is the long-term average annual level. And what you probably notice right away just from looking at this graphic, really without being able maybe to interpret some of the numbers, is that you can see we've gone through periods of high and low water throughout the last 100+ years of water levels. And a lot of people, if you remember the last high water period really of the mid to late 1980s, but then even more recently was a decade plus of low water, especially that can be noticed on Lake Michigan, Huron. You can see in the late 1990s, water levels plummeted and they stayed low for about a decade, culminating in a record low on Lake Michigan, Huron in January of 2013. However, the 2 to 3 years following that, we saw water levels take a rapid rise, and then eventually they even went above that long-term average annual level, or that red line. And then you can see that in the last 6-7 years, we've really stayed above that long-term average annual level as water levels have continued to climb on an annual basis. And a lot of that has to do with some of the wet conditions we've seen, and it really pushed us to some of the record highs we've seen in 2019 and 2020 across the Great Lakes. So why are water levels so high? How did we get here? And essentially, it's what I hinted at just on the last slide, is that we've had an exceptionally wet last few years. And what you're looking at here on this graphic is from NOAA, so this is only U.S. data, but this is annual precipitation for the Great Lakes Basin. So that's January to December precipitation. And you can see right across this gray line here is representing the 1901 to 2000 mean. So it's giving you about a 100-year average. And as you can see, this data goes back to 1895, and you can see we oscillated between above and below average, but you can see as of recently, we've stayed predominantly above average, and especially in the last 3 years, which I've highlighted there in that purple rectangular. 2017, 18, and 19 have been exceptionally wet in the Great Lakes region. And as a result, we've seen these high water levels in these years, 2019 and 2020. So I'm going to break this down a little bit and give an example of Lake Michigan Huron over the last couple years and how we've gotten to the high water levels of 2020. So I'm going to spend some time explaining this graphic a little bit. This is showing really daily and monthly mean water levels. So that's that line here. That black squiggly represents the daily lake-wide average water levels, and then the blue dots are the monthly mean water levels. These black dashes are the monthly long-term average levels, and then the gray dashes represent the record high and low monthly levels. So you can see I've highlighted here points 1 and point 2. As you can see, this is starting at September 2018. So as we were finishing 2018, going into 2019, we see that large rise in water level. And that was as a result of increased precipitation during the spring, which helped water levels rise to almost near records. Like Michigan Huron actually did set a record in 2019, but as you can see, it came very close. And then as we got into the fall period of last year, when we're typically supposed to see that decline, you can see the water level almost stayed relatively steady. And that was a result of the very wet fall we experienced last year and a very warm winter in December and January that really decreased evaporation off of the lake. And that set us up come January 2020, where we started to see record high monthly mean water levels. And we experienced those record high monthly mean water levels for 8 consecutive months to August 2020. And just this past month in September, we finally just fell slightly below the September record. So you can see that there's really two things that kind of led us to the record highs of 2020. So let's take a little deeper look. First, the 2019 seasonal rise, or this rise during the spring of that year. What you're looking at here are two graphics. One being the precipitation, which is here on the left. This is percent of normal precipitation. And anything that is a green or purple or blue is representing precipitation above normal. So you can see up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Northeast Wisconsin, those areas we're seeing 150 to 200% of average precipitation during the spring. So you can see March 1st to May 31st of 2019. The Lower Peninsula of Michigan was a little bit drier, but still above normal, which really helped some of the wetter conditions in that region. And then again in northern Illinois and part of southern Wisconsin, again is seeing those 150 to 200% of average precipitation. Then on the right, you can see graphics illustrating the stream flows in the region. And these are graphics from USGS. And stream flows can be really indicative of the runoff that's occurring in the basin. So, and that's part of our, our big net basin supply picture. Remember, precipitation plus runoff minus evaporation. So these wet conditions that we're experiencing in the spring, this is high precipitation, is also now impacting our stream flows or our runoff in the region. So this green color is representative near normal. The light blue is an indication of stream flows above normal. The darker blue is much above normal stream flow, and the black is saying stream flows are very high. And you can see in April, just as the spring is getting started, we can see that, we're starting to see a little bit of the impacts, especially in the Upper Peninsula and Northeast Wisconsin, with stream flows much above normal. But still, the Lower Peninsula of Michigan was fairly near normal. But you can see that storyline changes as we get into May and June. As the conditions had gotten wetter, we start to see an increase in some of the stream flows and runoff in the region. Now let's take a little bit deeper look into part 2. And that's the marginal seasonal decline that we saw last year. And so this is, again, similar graphics to what I showed for the spring precipitation. These are just now for the individual months of September and October. Again, you can see here, again, those greens, blues, purples, representing precipitation above normal. And you can see really in September of last year, of 2019, you can see that really Wisconsin and maybe the southern half of Michigan, or the western half of Michigan is experiencing much above normal precipitation. So, you can even see some of the pinks there. That's 300% of average precipitation in these areas of northern Illinois and in southern Wisconsin. And then again in October, we can see again precipitation above normal in the region. contributing to that lack of seasonal decline. So, even though, this is, the fall is a period of seasonal decline, if the wet conditions offset that evaporation that's occurring, you're going to get that water level that, just stays steady, kind of like what it did last year. And then again, just showing some of the stream flows or, an indication of runoff in the fall of last year. You can see in September, fairly near normal for most of the region. But then as we get into October, you can see the impacts of those 2 months of very wet conditions impacting the stream flows across the Great Lakes. And then as I mentioned before, it was in the first 2 months of winter, especially December and January, were warmer than normal. But this is showing a temperature anomaly, average temperature between December 1st and February 29th of 2020. And you can see that, really pretty much Wisconsin and Michigan is about 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit above normal for the winter. And really what happens there is, as I mentioned before, when you want to get evaporation, you need that warm lake and the colder air. So when that warmer air is into the region, now your temperature difference between the air and the water is less, so you decrease the amount of evaporation that can occur. And that's another thing that happened last fall. On top of the wet conditions, we did see a decrease in evaporation. So now I'm going to spend some time going over our forecasts, some of our forecast products. And some of these graphics are going to look similar to some of the ones that I've already showed you, but they're just a little different in how they're portrayed. So this is our 6-month forecast graphic. We do our 6-month forecast at the beginning of every month. So this one we did in the beginning of October, and it looks out 6 months. So currently it looks out to March of 2021. We coordinate, just as we coordinate our water levels, our monthly mean water levels with Canada, we also coordinate our 6-month forecast. So we work very closely with them. I'm going to go over kind of how to read this graphic. I'm only going to show this for Lake Michigan, Huron in this presentation, but at the link below you can access these graphics for each of the lakes. So as you can see here, there's a zero line that stretches across this graphic, which is called chart datum. The chart datum on Lake Michigan, Huron is 577.5 feet or 176 meters. You have your feet axis here on the left. The meters axis is over there on the right. And how you can estimate a water level on this graphic is by noting that each of the lines extending from that zero is about 2 inches. So, you have +2, +4 inches, and so on until you get to +1 foot, +2 feet, +3 feet, and so on. So that's how you would estimate a water level. But then a lot of these things are what we already talked about. So this blue dashed line is the long-term average monthly levels for each month. This red line is the observed monthly mean water levels going back from October 2018 all the way through September 2020. And then you'll see our forecast, which extends from October to March. That green dashed line is considered most probable, or we consider most likely to occur. And then the red bars, or whatever makes up that range, is our 90% probability range of water levels that could occur if wetter or drier conditions occur in the basin that, strays from that most probable line. So, if we experience wetter conditions, then what's likely will be closer to the top part of that band. And then you can see the record highs and lows for each month, denoted by those dashes at the bottom, and the year is the number that is associated with those. So as you can see, here on like we just talked about, you can see that large spring rise in 2019 and that lack of seasonal decline last year that allowed us really to start 2020 off at record highs. We saw record highs from January through August, denoted by those purple arrows there. And then in this last month in September, we just fell below the September record from 1986. Again, that period of record going back to 1918. The current forecast, or the current September level, was 3 inches above last year, but just below that record. But we do forecast water levels to be below record highs over the next 6 months. So that includes those provisional records from 2020, January through March. But as you can see, we're still well above average. So high water will still be a concern as we head into these next 6 months. Now, this last product I want to talk about is what we call the water level outlook. And we call it an outlook because it's a scenario-based tool, so it's not essentially a forecast, but it allows us to look out a little bit further than those 6 months. A lot of people ask, well, do you have anything that looks out maybe a little bit further? What can we expect next year? And so this tool helps to provide some of that information. So again, a very similar graphic to what you've seen over these last couple slides. Black dots are the long-term average monthly levels. The dashes at the top and bottom represent the record high and low monthly mean levels. And then the black solid line is the observed monthly mean levels we've seen since October of 2018 all the way through September of 2020. And then you'll see a couple different shaded areas. You'll see the gray shaded area, a purple, an orange, and then two separate lines. So this is, as I mentioned, this is a scenario-based tool. And so how do we, what does all those represent? And it's a scenario-based tool that uses historical water supply data. So as I mentioned, net basin supply, we have net basin supply data that goes back to 1900. So what we do with this tool is we say, given the current water level that we're at, which we have through September 2020, what will water levels look like if we have these historical net basin supply sequences? So we have about 100, close to 120 years worth of data that we can run through this routing model that allows us to produce a range of water levels based on historical water supply we've seen in the past. And that's represented by that gray range. So that's the full range of water levels that we could expect based off historical net basin supply. That orange shaded area and line is a 6-month forecast, which we just talked about. And then you'll see the purple range and the two lines. Those are based on our current scenario. So we produce a new scenario every 3 months, and we do this to help ourselves answer questions. So it allows us to say, okay, well, what if we were to have a very wet fall? Or what if we had a dry summer? So those are the types of things we can say, and then we can find years where that occurred and call them out specifically by a line or a range. And that's essentially what we've done here. I won't go into too much detail here on what each of these represents. I mean, right now the purple range is a representation of La Nina years. We had a La Nina develop in August of 2020 that is expected to last through the winter. So that purple range represents 15 years of La Ninas that developed either in the spring, summer, or fall, and continued through that winter, which is what we expect to happen this year. And then we've called out two lines specifically within that purple range to compare what conditions happened during those years. And there's a write-up that goes along with this, so if you want more information on more of the details of that, you can get that on the website. But it gives you an example of kind of what we can look at with this tool, and it at least provides that gray range. I mean, one thing with Lake Michigan Huron to note with that gray range is just that even under the driest scenarios, we're still above average over the next year on Lake Michigan Huron. So that's what I mean. We may be below records over the next six months, but water levels will remain high. Just because we're at very high water levels right now and the system is large, it takes time to recover. So this last slide here is just kind of going over some of the resources, some of the links I did provide in the presentation, but this gives you a summary of some of the links that we have that talk about our forecast. the water level observations, basin conditions, as well as a brochure on coastal impacts as well. And then I'll leave on this last slide, we also have a Great Lakes High Water webpage for here at the district that has a lot of great resources and contact information on it from the respective offices that can be pretty useful. And then lastly, the contacts here, my contact information there, Deanna Apps, my phone number and email, and then my supervisor, John Alice, as well. We're always happy to answer any water level questions that people may have, so feel free to reach out. And I look forward to the panel later this month to get a chance to answer some of those questions. So take care, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, well, that was a great presentation. That was our first two, and we're not going to take questions right now, but if you'll save them and if you want to jot them down or put them in the chat window, we'll come back to them. We're going to have our second presentation by Kurt Terhar. He's going to talk to us about specific impacts to Ottawa County parks and some of the results of some of these lake level changes that Deanna summarized so well. So just give me one moment.
Hi, my name is Kurt Terhar. I'm the Coordinator of Park Planning and Development for Ottawa County Parks, and I've been asked to give a little information about how the rising water levels of Lake Michigan have affected our park system. So I thought today I would give you a little bit of background on Ottawa County Parks, and especially our what we call our coastal greenway parks. Then give you some more information about the impacts of the water levels on those parks, and then finally give a little information about how we're responding to some of those issues. Some of you may know that Ottawa County Parks is a fairly large natural resource-based park system. We have larger regionally important land and parks that are suitable for lots of outdoor recreation. They typically are not like a municipal park where we have ball fields and playgrounds and those kind of things. We really focus on the natural resource based recreation activities. Altogether, Ottawa County has 40 different sites and, with over 7,000 acres, but I want to focus on, in particular, on our 6 lakeshore parks: North Beach, Rosie Mound, Kirk Park, Olive Shores, Tunnel Park, and our historic Ottawa Beach parks. All of those have Lake Michigan frontage, and we total over 8,500 linear feet of shoreline on Lake Michigan. So the first and most obvious effect of high water levels on our lakeshore parks is smaller beaches. And this can be a problem because it creates user conflicts. We're already very busy in the summer with beach use, and this just creates additional conflicts between users. We have one park in particular where we allow dogs on a portion of the beach in addition to people, and we had to adjust things to make that be possible throughout the summer. Here are a couple of photos showing the drastic reduction in beach size. This is at North Beach Park, our most northerly beach, and it really is primarily a beach park. Lots of sand, and you can see the size has been reduced by maybe 3/4 or so. Here's another example at Rosie Mound, where you can see the flat portion of the beach is basically non-existent, and the erosion of the banks going right down to the water's edge. One more example at our Olive Shores Park. This has never been a heavily used beach park because there is a significant walk to get there, but you can see the water level almost to the base of the existing stairs and very little area to spread out. Finally, Tunnel Park. This is one of our most heavily used beach parks. It's near Holland State Park, so the overflow from Holland State Park often comes here. Again, just very little flat area for people to enjoy. One last example at Kirk Park. This park gets a lot of use from out of county residents because it's a straight shot west from Grand Rapids. Again, very little flat beach area, and I'll show you some pictures later, but this also exhibits some of the larger dune erosion that we have at certain locations. As you've seen in some of the other photos of the beaches, in addition to just a smaller beach, in most locations we have now a steep bank or even a cliff um, coming down from the higher level down to the lower level of the beach. And this is causing a few different problems. One is just a safety issue. Kids like to dig into these banks, and there have been cases where the banks have collapsed even on some of these people. And so that's a concern, and we've been warning people about that. And in this park in particular, North Beach Park, we had a movable walkway that we put in seasonally that would get people from the parking area all the way down close to the water to provide some barrier-free access for those who are in wheelchairs or other or have other mobility issues. And that was basically impossible this year because the bank was 8, 10, or 15 feet high. In terms of natural features, another obvious impact is the loss of foredune. If you're familiar with the dune system along the coast of Lake Michigan, there often is a smaller, smaller dune structure near the lake with larger dunes behind, and so this is called the foredune. I would say that the foredune is typically a more dynamic system, so it changes with the lake levels, both building up and then getting eroded away. As you see here, I think the recent lake levels being as high as they are have made this process even more evident, and you'll see has caused us some other problems with some of our facilities. More examples of loss of foredune, this again at Tunnel Park. You can see again the cliff-like structures that are there, and on the right photo you can see our stairway comes down halfway down the slope, but instead of getting to a nice more level beach, you end up having to go over the steep slope. One more example at Olive Shores. This one maybe not quite so severe, but again a bunch of the foredune with the associated dune vegetation has been eaten away and is much smaller than it was before. Some of the most significant damage to our dune features has occurred at Kirk Park. Kirk Park never had much of a foredune at all, none of the smaller dune in front, and instead it had very large dunes close to the lake. So here these dunes are 100 to 150 feet above the lake level, and the entire lakeward facing slope has basically slid down into Lake Michigan. This used to be fully vegetated with mostly dune grass, but some large trees actually slid down the whole way right down to the base of the slope. So this will take a long time to get restabilized. We do know this happened in the 80s as well, but this is maybe even more severe than the 80s. In terms of built structures and facilities, as you might guess, as with a lot of homeowners along the lake shore, stairways and boardwalks to access the beach have been impacted greatly. This is Kirk Park. We had some walkways and boardwalk on the crest of the bluff overlooking the lake. Some of that has been eroded away and fallen down. And one of the beach access stairways, which actually accesses our dog beach, has now obviously become unusable. More than half of it eroded away into the lake. So far, we've had 5 or 6 of these type of damages, and we estimate at about $100,000 to repair it. But we'll have to see if things get worse or better as we move ahead. Here's another pretty dramatic example of damage to our facilities at Rosie Mound. You can see on the left, in 2010, we had a nice stairway going through the dune grass down the bank to the nice flat beach. By 2015, about half of that stairway had to be removed and closed off. And finally, on the right, you see currently there is no stairway anymore. There's just a deck at the top of the slope where the stairway used to come down. We've been trying to do some things to save that in the hopes that conditions will improve and we could keep it. But some of those things have, the initial improvements that we did have already been undermined. We extended the posts of this deck, and you can see some of those are already fully exposed now. But we are trying to maintain that if we can, but it's yet to be seen whether that will be successful. Here's some more photos of Rosie Mound. There are actually two access points. This is at the north one. You can see on the left there was a large series of steps and boardwalks leading down the foredune from this upper level deck, and now currently just the upper level deck, and again close to being undermined itself. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Ottawa County Parks is basically a natural resource-based park. So most of our parks have natural shorelines, natural dunes without much development other than the decks and stairways that I showed you previously that could be affected. At North Beach Park, however, we do have a large shelter. It's been around for a long time, since at least the 1920s. Used to be a long way away from the lake, but now is fairly close. We wouldn't say it's imminently in danger of falling in, but there are some worries about it because it would be expensive to replace. So this would be one area where, yeah, a large investment is in danger. One area that we maybe didn't anticipate being affected by the high water levels is neighbor relations. This is again at North Beach Park. You can see the shelter there, but if you look further down, you can see a residence right there at the edge of the park. And that residence was very close to being undermined by the high water, and so they were willing to expend a great amount of funds to add riprap shoreline to protect that. In fact, there were 8 or 10 houses along this same stretch that felt that that was what they needed to do to protect their homes. So they did ask the parks if we would allow access for their contractors to get to that shoreline. Very little good access points for large equipment, lots of materials that need to be brought in. So we did work out an agreement with them to allow a contractor to go through the park to access the shoreline and do those improvements. In addition to the Lake Michigan shoreline properties, we do have some other park properties that are on connecting waterways. That would be the Grand River and Lake Macatawa, that are kind of connected to Lake Michigan. No, they are connected. And the water levels are affected by the water levels of Lake Michigan. So here we have properties on the Lake Macatawa shoreline that were impacted. Here they actually started, the water started undermining some of our actual facilities, our walkways, and so forth. So this was something that needed to be dealt with fairly quickly because of some of the safety concerns. In addition to some of the walkways in the Ottawa Beach area, we also have a small marina that's quite close to Lake Michigan, just inside the channel to Lake Macatawa. And this was affected in a couple different ways. We did have actual flooding in some of our parking areas when the water was particularly high or after a heavy rain. So it took a while for that to drain away. There are also some issues with the docks themselves. You can see the water is quite close to the level of the dock. These docks are fixed, so that's the elevation that they're going to be at, and sometimes the high water causes some difficulties for people mooring their boats. The pilings aren't quite tall enough to moor too nicely, or the pilings are at a wrong level for the height of the boat. Some issues like that, in addition to if it's just very wavy, you actually get water that goes over the deck surface. We also had some issues on the Grand River, and it is quite amazing how far the Grand River kind of backs up based on Lake Michigan. And we have a number of spots where we have these kayak launch systems. It's a floating dock, which is great, that adjusts to the water level that we have, but they're connected with a gangway that's to a fixed point on the shoreline. And here you see the way it's supposed to work in that center picture. That gangway is connected on the right. You can't quite see that, and adjusts with the water level. But when the water is too high, that connection point is actually flooded. And so we had that at several of these launches. We actually have them at 4 different locations, and I think all of them at one time or another this past year were affected by the high water and were not usable. We have worked to get some temporary measures in place so that they can be usable, but we weren't quite expecting Lake Michigan to affect the Grand River as much as it did this year. So what have we done in response to this? Well, a number of different things. First thing we did was work on our communication. We needed people to know that the beaches were small, which they maybe knew already, but that they should just be aware of that when they're coming. We did some work and signage to let people know about the cliffs so that they would not be unsafe in climbing on them or digging into them. And as I mentioned, at Kirk Park, we actually have a dog beach where people, anyone may go there, but dogs in particular are allowed there all the time. We actually had to change that total system because there was no real beach to use. And so instead we used a time system where regular beach users could use it during the warm daylight times when beach users usually like it, and that dog owners could use the beach earlier in the morning and later in the evening. In some cases, as the picture shows below, we did actually go with an engineering solution. This is Ottawa Beach in the photo. You can see we put new riprap along the shoreline. This is right at the entry of the channel into Lake Macatawa. It gets a lot of wave action from Lake Michigan and is very vulnerable to erosion. So we actually did do an engineering solution. Here you can see we actually replaced a number of sections of concrete that were undermined in the spring. So I mentioned the kayak launches problems. We actually, the solution that we came up with was to use portable dock sections, similar to what you'd use on any lake that can be put in and out seasonally. And these we use to kind of bridge that gap between the fixed point that is now flooded and shoreline that is not flooded. So these sections would fit between there and allow people to get out to the actual kayak launch without getting their feet wet. You saw the picnic shelter that is close to being undermined. We haven't done anything yet. We're kind of waiting to see, but we are preparing to do that. It's on the Lake Michigan shoreline in a critical dune, in a critical erosion zone, so it does require permitting. And so we have the permit ready to go in case we need to do some measures. We've looked at a number of different things to do there. The solution that we're preferencing right now is a large kind of a geotube, or it's a large sandbag that would be kind of semi-permanent and take us through hopefully the worst part of this high water. And we've kind of just had to let people access the beach any way they can, right? And we want to provide stairs and boardwalks to make it easy for people. Those are just not accessible. So people are just accessing the beach as best they can. We still designate areas where it's best to do that. And eventually it wears down, so it's easier for people to get there. But we just kind of have to let that go, let people find their way down as best they can. And unfortunately, a lot of what we are doing is just wait and see what's going to happen. A lot of these stairs and boardwalks are still in danger of collapse if things get worse. We really don't feel it's prudent at this point to try to replace them, given the volatile nature of the situation. So we are kind of in a wait and see mode for long-term solutions to that. I mean, hopefully things settle down and it's a little more stable. We can look at doing some things to make it easier for people to get down to the beach. So I'm happy to take any questions if you have them. Otherwise, thank you for your time.
Awesome. That was great. Thanks, Kurt and Deanna. So we're going to open up for questions now, and they're both here. Let me try and highlight them both. Let's see if I can find them on my screen here. So Kathy, do you want to go ahead and post some of the questions out of the chat for a second while I get things set up here?
Sure. Thanks for these. These are great questions. Thank you for all of you watching, and thanks, Deanna and Kurt, for that presentation. So let me ask just to throw this out, and maybe this is more directed to Kurt, but one of the questions are there certain native plant communities we can grow alongside the shoreline dunes that would help stabilize the dune front better?
Yeah, well, the tested and true natural solution is what we call dune grass, right? That's the grassy thing you see all over the place. The trouble is in these dynamic environments it's kind of made for that actually, but when it gets too big, it's hard to plant so much of it to do what we want to do. I would say that during the 80s, we did a lot of it, the park system, I should say, with volunteers on some of these slopes that were unstable and not vegetated to do dune grass plantings. And that was effective for the last 30 years. So that may have to happen again when we think things are stable enough to try it.
And what would be the cost? Looking at the cost, is that a huge cost, or is it just more of a labor thing?
It is. It's a labor-intensive thing. That's why we have done it with volunteers. We do have a great volunteer program in the park, so that would probably be how we would go about it.
All right, thank you. What about invasive species? Someone asked if the invasive species like knapweed contribute to the dune decline.
Yeah, I don't really think that's a factor in what we're seeing now. That is a plant species that thrives in sandy soil, and we try to eradicate it where we can in our parks. So, but I don't think that's really a cause of this.
Okay, thanks. And this is kind of interesting. This is probably this may be a catch-22 question that someone posted, but aren't people in the dunes contributing to the erosion, and can we restrict people access to the dunes in order to reduce the erosion?
I mean, I think I don't think that is the issue right now, and that is classically why we do the boardwalks and stairways, is we try to provide a easily accessible way to get down there without destabilizing other parts of the dune. So yeah, long term that is something we would try to do, but as for what's happening now, it's not really a contributing factor.
Okay, thank you. And this might be more directed to Deanna, but what's your assessment of the long-term effects of climate change on Great Lakes water levels? And also with that, do the scientists with Environment and Climate Change Canada concur with your assessment of climate change impacts on the Great Lakes water levels?
Oh, you're muted, Deanna. Unmute yourself, or else ask.
There we go. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. So to start to answer that question, we coordinate our forecast with, or at least our 6-month forecast with Environment and Climate Change Canada. We work very closely with them. We're in coordination, most days of the week. That's how closely we work with them. So to answer the question in regards to climate change on Great Lakes water levels, obviously over the past several years, we've seen unprecedented precipitation, and that has brought water levels from generally that period of low water to a period of high water. So we've seen these conditions, in the weather, in the climate, that have led us to the high water that we are in now. However, the changes in climate in the Great Lakes region, they can affect those components of water supply that I mentioned in the presentation: precipitation, evaporation, and runoff, in sometimes complex and counteracting ways, making the direct attribution to water level changes in attributing those to climate change more challenging. As I talked about in the presentation, there's many different variables that are at play in different parts of the year. There's a bunch of different meteorological variables that you have the standard precipitation, evaporation, runoff, but then those also are depending on air temperature and surface water temperatures and ice cover and things like that. And to really understand how water levels are going to change over the long term, we have to know how all those variables are going to change over time as well. And that's what makes water levels and that attribution to climate change just a very challenging question to answer.
Thank you. I appreciate one of the questions was about groundwater, and it was asking about do we know does any water seep into the aquifers under the land, and do we know how much?
So that's an interesting question. From our standpoint, water that recharges aquifers does not typically directly factor into our computation of the water budget for the Great Lakes. It can be indirectly accounted for in the models that simulate the translation of precipitation or runoff. And typically, the climatic conditions that lead to high groundwater also lead to higher lake levels. But as far as the Great Lakes, are concerned, it's common practice to assume that groundwater movement into the lakes is negligible, rather relative to the other components of the water cycle.
Thank you. Another question was, have we seen this kind of erosion historically, and does the beach recover this footage back over time, or is it just continuously lost?
I can try to answer that question. Based on some of my knowledge of how dunes are built. So under the current situation where the water is high, there is not much room for the wind to catch sand. When the water goes down on that, then you have a flat beach area. That is an area that the wind can catch sand and move it inland, and thereby rebuilding some of the dunes. So when I mentioned that before, I think the foredune is kind of a dynamic system that way. It gets eaten away on high water times, and it would build up during low water times. Peter, you maybe know more about that than me.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I actually, I've had students find historic cans in the foredunes from the 80s. So those foredunes weren't there, they were built after the 80s probably. And so a lot of those foredunes that are going away are not that old. They actually have historic, cans and things in them that are clearly not that old.
Another question. Are there excessive outflows from Superior into Huron, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and does that impact the levels of Lake Huron and Lake Michigan?
So as I mentioned in the presentation, there is outflow regulation done through the St. Mary's River between Lake Superior and Lake Michigan Huron. And that's in reference to Plan 2012, which is run through the International Joint Commission through the International Lake Superior Board of Control. There's plenty of study and information that goes into creating these plans. In that plan, it starts with a pre-project flow, but it has a balancing principle in this regulation plan to take into account high Lake Superior water levels as well as Lake Michigan Huron water levels to help balance and recently with the in relatively speaking and in recent months with Lake Michigan Huron being at record highs, there has been that balancing principle has actually allowed outflows to be reduced in light of the fact that according to this balancing principle, relatively speaking, Lake Michigan Huron water levels are high and they're at record highs compared to Lake Superior. So the outflow does that's under regulation plan and does the best it can. But when both lakes are at such high waters, it can be hard to find that balance.
Thank you. Peter, did some people send in some questions earlier
Yeah,
for
let
the
me
Google Drive if they
check that
want
one.
to check those?
Yeah, there was a couple questions that were sort of similar. They were along the lines of, what can someone who lives along the lakes do about the situation? Is there anything they can do to contribute or get involved in helping or understanding what's going on? Or is there anything that citizens can do to help the parks, or is there any way they can get involved in any of this process?
Yeah, that's a hard one, Peter. Yeah, you're fighting, we always say water always wins. It seems. I think, yeah, once we kind of think we're at a more stable situation, there will be ways for citizens to help. Like I said, we use volunteers to restabilize dunes a lot in the 80s. I'm hoping there's a time where that could happen again. I don't know what citizens can do for the overall problem.
That's a big issue.
Yeah.
There is a kind of related question that there was someone asked about the dredging in the channel. I assume that's the Grand River Channel this summer. And what happens to that sand? Where do they put it? Do they put it north of the pier or south of the pier? Do you know, Kurt or Yana?
Yeah, I believe in Grand Haven it was put south of the pier. In Holland they did it and they put it north of the pier. So it just as a beach replenishment where they thought it was needed most.
That makes sense.
Another interesting question, because Kurt, you brought this up about volunteering. Could you include school groups for volunteering?
Oh, we do a lot of that already. Yeah, we have huge numbers of school kids. In fact, there's some days in the spring, I think we have more than 400 kids at a time at various sites. So yeah, that would be something we would look at. Because it's fairly simple to do, right? It's anybody can do it. Kids can do it, adults can do it. So yeah.
Another question is, are outflows at the Chicago River reduced?
Yeah, so for the Chicago diversion, that's been the same flow for many years. In the late 1960s, a Supreme Court decree was set to make that outflow 3,200 CFS, and it's still to this day set to be 3,200 CFS.
With average seasonal temperatures expected to rise and subsequent reduced icing over the lakes, could we expect to see increased precipitation?
That's a tricky question. I think a lot of that is going to depend, if average seasonal temperatures are expected to rise, reducing ice cover. So here's a perfect example of, higher seasonal temperatures. I'm assuming this is alluding to the winter, was last year. It wasn't even so much precipitation as, we were in the winter time, but the warmer than normal temperatures kept the lakes open, kept them fairly ice free for most of the winter. And it reduced that amount of evaporation. So, that led to some higher, water levels for Lake Michigan, Huron. Now let's, for example, say, precipitation is greater during, certain times of the year, let's say in the winter, because we don't form a snowpack because the temperatures are so much warmer. That could, have impacts too. So, but also let's phrase it this way too. Let's say you have higher temperatures in the summer, and the lakes warm up really, really warm, and then we have a very cold fall. Now we could have increased evaporation. We could, lower that water level decline more, because we're having those warmer temperatures in the summer versus the fall. So that's what I mean. It's kind of always a timing thing, because different variables are in play at different times of the years that could result in different impacts to the water levels.
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay,
It's a
good.
very dynamic system.
It is. Time for one more question, maybe, and then if Deanna and Kurt were willing to stick around, maybe for 5 minutes, if people wanted to stick around for the last few questions. But is there one more question? Let's see. There was a question about the North Shore Park, and it sounds like there was some concern about the contractors and how they access the park or something like that in the chat.
Yeah, I saw that one come up. Yes, the contractors did damage some pavement and walkways there. It is scheduled to be repaired yet this fall. So that was part of the agreement, right?
They fix anything they break. Huh? Okay.
Yeah, fix it if they broke it. Yes.
That's good. That's good. So you said there was eight neighbors that had done repairs or done?
Directly north of the park. Yeah, 8 or 10 right in a row that all did this similar riprap.
So it's all big rock, pretty much?
It's all big rock. Yep, very big rock. Yeah.
Interesting. So were you just out of curiosity, were you asked about the permit for that by the DNR or?
Yep, they did ask about that as a neighbor, and in fact they needed kind of our okay as a neighbor to pursue it. I know there's some different thoughts about the different treatments that you might use. I guess we didn't feel like we wanted to be an obstinate neighbor and say no, you can't do it.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, I've seen a lot of people doing the sand kind of big huge sandbag approach.
Yep.
Was common further south, I think, but that seems like at least a little more easy thing to remove if you had to remove it later, but a little more.
Right. And that's what we're looking at for our shelter, because yeah,
at least you could take it out and it's going to be similar to what's already there. But yeah, the big rocks are hard to kind of take out. A lot of work.
I think a lot of people are hoping that if this foredune builds up again, a lot of that rock will get covered. We'll see, right?
We'll see it. Yeah. I mean, certainly there's all kinds of stuff getting uncovered right now. That's for sure. Every time I go down there, I see a new stairway or something that's getting uncovered from previous times. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. And can you all stick around for just a bit, Kurt and Deanna, just in case there's a few other questions?
Yep.
Okay. So we'll call this the end of the formal presentation. And thank you very much, both Kurt and Deanna. Great presentations. But if you want to stick around, people want to stick around for a few minutes and ask a few more questions, I think we'll go ahead and stick around for a few minutes. So thank you so much. And there was something posted in the chat about if you want to know about future events, we are planning a couple more of these. So if you want to submit the information there, we'll definitely get a hold of you for the next event that comes up. So thank you. Let's see, is there another question? So I had a question for you, Deanna, while we're waiting for, there's a lot of discussion about like whether ice cover, what impact that has like on the evaporation. How would you summarize the effect of ice cover in the winter?
Yeah, that's an interesting, it's always a hard to answer type question, but I'll do my best. So the way I always try to look at it as long as the lake stays open, the opportunity for evaporation exists. Once you get that ice cover, the evaporation will cease in those specific areas. But as long as that, that lake stays open, evaporation can occur. But that also then is reliant on the temperature of the air that's moving over the lake. So if you continue to have, warmer than normal, or you're not creating a large temperature difference between the lake and the air, you won't get much evaporation. If you continue to have cold air outbreaks over the, relatively warm lake surface, you can see increased evaporation. Perfect example, this past month, it's been fairly colder than normal. We had very warm summer that really, especially in July, August, the water temperatures were very warm. And we've really seen a lot of increased evaporation over the last month. So it's hard to say,
like I said, if with the lake staying ice free, that potential for evaporation exists. So it gives you a greater chance of evaporation occurring, but doesn't mean it always is going to happen.
Great, thank you. Let's see. There was the one question about the rate of erosion of the high dunes versus the lower foredunes. Take a shot at that, Kurt.
I don't know if I can say much about the rate. I think it's just matters what's close to the lake. Like I mentioned, most of our parks have a foredune, so that's what's been taking the brunt of the waves and the high water, and that's pretty easy to deal with. Like I said, the dunes at Kirk Park are a large kind of, yeah, a much larger massive dune that's so close that, yeah, it eroded the toe of that slope. So the whole face of it slid down. So thankfully that's only in one of our parks. But it's fairly dramatic, right? And I think in the 80s that happened. That's when you see the cottages, they're up on the bluffs falling in, right? They're on this high dune that the face gets eroded away and it falls down. Now there hasn't been as much of that because now they don't let you build on the crest of the dune like that anymore. Although there have been houses that have moved back, historically are quite close, and they've had to move them or abandon them. But really,
Yeah.
it matters what's close.
And
Yeah.
Rosie's, the south end of Rosie's getting pretty close to being in the big dunes, right? It's really close.
South side of Rosie is, yes.
Yeah.
Higher dunes there that are very close.
Let's see. Oh, so I guess, yeah, there was a question about the riprap solution. I don't know if you guys can address that or not, but whether that's a good solution or a bad solution, I guess it's somewhat in the eye of the beholder. But I don't know, what do you have an opinion, Kurt, or on riprap?
Well, yeah, aesthetically, obviously, it's, it isn't your classic Lake Michigan shoreline anymore. We've had a couple of people say, oh, this is what it looks like on, Lake Erie or, some of these more highly developed areas, which is bad. The other thing the engineers will talk about you, and we're kind of watching this, especially like that, the one that I showed that's on the north edge. Do we get increased erosion on our site because of the wave action against a fairly hard, hard surfaces that reflect the wave energy? So we're watching that pretty carefully right now. It doesn't look like that's happening too much.
So yeah, one of the complications on the Lake Michigan shore is you get longshore movement of sand up and down the beach, and that varies seasonally. And so even though it's not happening now, it might actually happen later depending on what direction that sand is moving. So yeah,
Right.
Whenever you put those hard structures, you can definitely get local erosion depending on which way that sand's moving. And it's pretty complicated, I think, what direction it moves depending on where you're at on the beach.
Right.
Let's take a question for you, Deanna. Does the Corps have any structural improvement plans to increase capacity and flexibility to address high or low levels in the lake? So like changes in plumbing? I don't know. I think, is there any envision changes in plumbing, like for anything like the Detroit River or anything? Or oh, I think you're muted, Deanna. Sorry. There you go.
Oh, no, sorry. Not at this time, not that I'm aware of.
All right, thanks.
I have a question about the basic physics of evaporation. You said the difference in temperature increases it, particularly if it's cold over warm water. That's higher evaporation rate than warm over warm, or cold over warm, or warm over cold. Can someone explain?
Yep. So you want the colder air moving over the relatively warm lake. So the most significant evaporation would occur when the lake was very warm and the air was very cold.
Mhm.
And I know that almost seems a little counterintuitive than to maybe what most people think. But the way I can only really describe it is, boiling water on the stove. As that water gets hotter and hotter, then you start to see, the steam coming off the water. And that's now because that air that's surrounding it is cold, is colder, and because you've warmed up that lake. So it's that colder air that moves over that relatively warm lake surface that can get that evaporation process started.
Okay.
All right, well, I want to be respectful of your time, Kurt and Deanna. I don't want to take too much of your time, but there is one last question maybe we'll take on the chat. Deanna, it says, when water levels are recently very low, they were advocates of blocking the flow of the St. Clair River. Could that be modified to maybe allow more water to flow up the St. Clair River, I guess? So asking whether you could somehow, tweak that as a valve, I guess, to control the levels of the lakes.
The water flowing through the St. Clair River is very natural. It's very, I will say, it's monitored very closely, and it has been over the recent years, especially as we've transitioned from low to high water. So it's something that is monitored, but I mean, because it is just, it's a natural flow. So we don't really have control over that flow that's happening there.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, thank you so much. And we won't take any more of your time. I think you've been very gracious with your time, and thank you so much for doing the presentations for us. And I'm sure if people have questions, they could probably email you if they have questions still afterwards, or
Absolutely.
we'll make sure your emails get on the website so they can find you. And then whatever you're willing to share in terms of the PowerPoints and stuff, we'll put those on our website if you're willing to share those. And
Sure.
so thank you very much. And thank you everyone else for coming that's still here. And if you have other questions, you can pose them by email. So thank you.
Super.
All right,
Thanks.
Great,
bye-bye.
thank you.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.